In this lecture, we're going to see that we can pass default parameters to event constructors. Here is the class we have been using a while ago, the cylinder class. It had a few member variables, base radius and the height, and it had a few other members. For example, we have two constructors here, one which is the default and the other that is taking two parameters. And we have two getters, two setters, and a volume function, which is going to compute the volume for this cylinder. What we want to see is how we can pass default parameters to constructors. And it is nothing new. The syntax you use is really simple. You already know this syntax from functions. You just specify your default parameter using an equal sign and assign the value that you want to assign to your member variable. So for example, when we do this, it will be possible to call this constructor with only one parameter, and then the compiler is going to autofill in the second to be a 10. But if you want, you can even specify the two parameters when you call the constructor, and then the compiler is not going to use the default that we have provided here. So if we have a constructor like this in place, we can call our function like we see here with one parameter. And if we print the base radius, we're going to see that it's going to be a 5. Let's go back and see which default we specified. Yes, it is the second parameter. So the first one is the base radius, which is going to be 5 here. And for the second one, the compiler is going to use the default and it is going to print 10 here. I really want you to understand this. So this is how you can pass default arguments to your constructors. But it is also possible to specify all the two parameters. So for example, the base radius is going to be 5 by default here, and the height is going to be 10 by default. So when you have a setup like this, please be careful to see that you don't have a default constructor in place. Because if we have these two constructors in place and they are set up like this, and we set up a call which doesn't pass any parameter, the compiler is going to be confused. It's going to look at this call and then it's going to say, I have two constructors that can actually service this call here. So which one do I choose? It can use the default constructor and not pass any parameters. It can also call our parameter taking constructor and use the default. Let's go back and really let you see this. So if we don't specify a parameter, this constructor here, which is the default, doesn't take any parameter, is a candidate. It can service that call. But the constructor here, which has two default parameters, can also be called by the compiler, and then the compiler is going to fill in these two default values. So when you have a setup like this and you set up a call like this, your compiler is going to be confused and you're going to have a compiler error. And to solve this problem, you have no other way but to choose between the two constructors. You're going to choose which one you like and which one you don't like, and you're going to take out which one you don't want, and the compiler is going to choose the one you are left with. Okay, this is really all there is about default parameters with constructors. We are going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is default parameters for constructors. We are going to grab our template files like we always do, and we're going to put them in place. And we are going to open this in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. This is going to open our folder. We can bring up the main CPP file, and we're going to clean our main CPP file a little bit and the main function here. And we're going to put in the class we want to use to play with these things. Remember, we have designed a cylinder class before, so we're going to put this in here. We're going to create a file which is going to contain the header file, and we're going to create another one which is going to be our implementation file. It's going to be cylinder.cpp. We're going to open up our header file and put in our class. You see it is the cylinder class, and we are going to open the CPP file and put in our implementation. In this lecture, we're going to go a little simple and put our constant directly in our cylinder.h file because we want to keep things simple. So this is going to be picked up by the functions that include cylinder, and then we're going to have our constant here, which is what we want to compute the volume. Now that we have this, we can actually go in the main CPP file and use our class. Let's do that. We're going to include cylinder. and we're going to create a cylinder object. We can do something like cylinder C1 and pass in two parameters. One is going to be the base radius, let's use 10, and the other is going to be the height. And we can print the volume for this cylinder here. We're going to say volume C1 and say volume. I think we have this function here, and let's go back and make sure we have that. Double volume, it's going to return the volume for our cylinder. And if we go down, we have an implementation for this method. I think this is going to work. So what problem do we have here? Oh, we need a semicolon. Sorry for this. We are going to build now with GCC. We can close this left pane. We don't need it anymore here. You see that the build is good. We can bring up a terminal to run this program. We can clear and run Rooster. If we run, we're going to see our volume here. So the class is working and it is doing whatever it is we want it to do. What we want to see is that we can pass default parameters. And the syntax to do that is what we saw in the slides. So for example, we can come here and on the second parameter specify 10 as our default parameter. The moment we do this, we still have the ability to call our constructor like this in the main function. We can specify all the parameters, and the compiler is going to use what we specify when we set up our objects like this. But because we have a default parameter, now we have the option to leave out the second parameter, and the compiler is going to autofill that in. You see that if we specify one parameter and we don't have any constructor that only takes one parameter, we're not going to get a compiler error. The compiler knows that it can autofill in the second parameter by using the default parameter that we specified in our constructor declaration here. And another thing you should know is that if you are splitting your constructor into declaration and definition like we are doing here, the declaration is in the header file and the definition is in the implementation file. We don't have to specify the default parameter again in the implementation. If you do that, you're going to get a compiler error because this is not valid C++ syntax. So we don't need to do this. Okay, so now we have this in. We can try and build and see what the compiler is going to do. It's going to use the default parameter and autofill that in, and our height is going to be 10. If we clear and run Rooster, we're going to see that it has used 10 as our height, and we have the same output as we did before. But another thing you can do is also specify that the first parameter is going to have a default value. We can go in and put that in, and now we will have a problem, because now we have the option to set up a call like this to construct our cylinder object, but the compiler is going to see that it has two options to do this. It can either use the default constructor, which is not going to take any parameter, or it can call our cylinder constructor, which is taking two parameters, but use the default parameters in here. So the compiler doesn't know which one to choose. You're going to see that if we comment out any of these, let's comment out the default one because it is easier. It doesn't have an implementation, so we can just comment it out here in the header. We can go back to main and we're going to see that the squiggly line is going to go away. And if we build, we're going to get the output that we want. You see the build is good. We can clear and run Rooster. We're going to see our volume here, but I think it is better to really prove that this constructor was used. We can either do that through the debugger. If we set up a breakpoint in the constructor here, we're going to see that, but we can also put an output statement in here. So let's say stdc out, two parameter constructor called, and we're going to put stdendl here. And you see that stdc out has a squiggly line here. The reason is we don't have access to IO stream here. It wasn't included in this file, and this is not going to compile. So we need to include that. We can include IO stream here. And the moment we do that, the squiggly line here should go away, and we should be able to compile and run this application and prove that the two parameter constructor was used to build this object here. Let's do that. We're going to run our task to build with GCC. The build is good. We can clear and run Rooster. We're going to see two parameter constructor called. It is going to construct our object, And if we print the volume, we're going to see that the default values were used. If, for example, we go in and change the default height to be 5 and build again, we're going to see that it was used. So let's build. We're going to use GCC to do that. You can really play with this however you want. You see the build is good. We can clear and run roster. We're going to see that our volume is going to change because now the default is 5 for the height. And if you plug in this radius and this height and compute your volume, you're going to see that the volume is exactly what you see here. We can also comment out this constructor. We can do that, but we will have to also go in the implementation file and comment that out and still use the default. Let's go back to our header and we're going to uncomment the default. Now we're going to be using the default, which is not passing in any parameter, and it's going to use whatever we initialized our member variables with. So our volume is going to change if we use this default constructor here. We can build and really prove this. So we're going to run the task to build with GCC. You see the build is good. We can clear and run rooster. Now you see that our volume is 3.14 because we are basically using a base radius of 1 and a height of 1. So if we multiply these guys, we're just going to get pi, which is 3.14 here. And you see that either of these constructors is going to work, but we can't have them both in, or the compiler is going to be confused. Okay, so this is really all we set out to do in this lecture, showing you how you can use default parameters for your constructors. Let's uncomment all these constructors and only leave in one with a single default parameter. And we're going to hop over in the CPP file and uncomment this. I think this is going to be better. And if we set up a call like this, we're going to use the default constructor, but we can call this with only one parameter and put in one parameter here for the base radius. So the syntax to do default parameters is really simple. You just specify your value with an equal sign here, and it's going to be used by the compiler when you specify less than the full number of parameters you have in here. You just have to be careful to order your parameters in a way that makes sense to you. If you specify the default parameter first here, for example, it's really going to be awkward because you can't specify a default parameter and have the other one not filled. Let's show you what I mean here, and I am lucky I remembered this. So let's put an equal sign here and specify the default parameter first here. If we do things like this, we don't really have a way we can call this, because if we go in here and only specify one parameter, the compiler won't have a way to guess the second one, and we're going to get a compiler error. So we really have no choice except specifying all the parameters here, and this way the compiler is going to be happy. So it's going to ignore the default parameter here, and it's going to use everything you specify when you try to construct an object here. Let's try and build and see that this is actually going to build. And we're going to see that we have a compiler error actually. The compiler is going to stop us from doing something like this because it knows it really doesn't make sense. You won't have a way to call this constructor and use this default parameter if you specify it like this here. So this is even better. The compiler is stopping us from setting up something that will never make sense. So this is good. We're going to put our default argument in the second position here. And you're going to see that the compiler now is going to be happy. If we build, we should build fine. You see, the build is good. And we are able to only specify one parameter when we call our constructor here. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to learn about initializer lists. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.